I'm Wesley Lim. I'm a lecturer in German Studies at the Australian National University. German Studies is really interesting. It grew out of German literature, but German Studies is kind of is a broader field. So it does look at literature, but it also looks at art. It looks at music, psychology, sociology, and it just creates a wider breadth encompassing what actually is German and questions that. One of the projects I'm looking at is my first book, which is called Dancing with the Modernist City, Metropolitan Dance Texts around 1900. And this was a project I started that came out of my dissertation. And it was really inspiring to be in Berlin at the time. This was 2009, reading these texts, these modernist texts that were basically about the city, of living in Berlin and living in Paris. And I felt like a little bit that I was experiencing what these writers were also feeling as well. And what's been really interesting in reading these texts is I'm looking at how they had visited dance performances of particular famous modern dancers like Loie Fuller and Václav Nijinsky. But on the other hand, they were also feeling and experiencing the city for the first time as well. And this was actually very new for them. And so what I'm looking at is looking at how these things are interweaving in each other and becoming and manifesting themselves in the literature that they're writing. And that's one of the things, and that's what one of my arguments, and I'm coining this term, which is the Metropolitan Dance Text, which looks at kind of the experience of living in the city, looking how it is to be there, looking at different kind of urban phenomena, and then comparing that and how this becomes melded into kind of the dance representations that they're looking at. And one of the other things I find interesting that I think lends itself into this is that I'm also a former dancer. So during my undergraduate, I completed a minor and I did ballet and modern. And so this is one of the things that always in the back of my mind has always kind of influenced me and influenced obviously my research, but also the way I kind of view things. And it's kind of my perspective when I look at things to always kind of see dance and performance in almost everyday life. Hi, I'm Wesley Lim. I'm a lecturer in German Studies at the Australian National University. So my first book project is called Dancing with the Modernist City, Metropolitan Dance Texts around 1900. And my interest in the project stemmed a lot from the fact of living in Berlin when I was working on my dissertation, and living in Berlin, experiencing the city similar to how some of the authors I'm looking at had experienced it as well around 1900. Andreas Hüssin, who was a scholar at Columbia, had written a text called Modernist Miniatures back in 2007. And I read that, and while I was living in Berlin and writing about my text, I thought it was really interesting to look at how modern texts at this time were very short. They were focused a lot on kinesthetic experience of the writer living in the city, a bit of psychological appeal as well, but really focused on the way that the text was conveyed and looking at media as itself, media as it's trying to convey what it's trying to convey, and not necessarily plot or Handlung, and we would say in German. The thing that I built my argument off of what he's talking about is looking at how writers, when they moved to the city, were not just talking about their experiences, but also I'm looking at the dancing body, which is particularly important with modernist writers at the time. Right, the body was breaking it away from classical forms like ballroom dancing for social dance, but also the balletic form as well, and looking at going back to what the body really wanted to, and it's more quote unquote natural, some would argue it's not natural, way of how the body was feeling, etc. And this is the way that a lot of modernist dancers had also been performing at the time. So basically I'm looking at how that kind of body, that kind of movement also kind of melds into the kind of modernist experience of living in a city, and having different kinds of modernist movement, whether it's the subway moving by, or if it's a person, or it's a crowd of people gathering around. I have this kind of dance and performance-like lens when I'm kind of looking at the way that these authors at the time were looking at and how these kinds of things had found representation and manifested themselves in their literature.